Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Crypt13, and today I want to talk about Ganyu's weapon choices. I'm going to talk about all of her free-to-play options and the Amos Bow and the Skyward Harp. There are a lot of numbers in this video, but the numbers don't tell the whole story, so I went ahead and visualized those numbers for us. The results and the conclusion that I came to were actually quite surprising, so let's just jump right into it. The weapon that is most commonly being recommended for Ganyu's best in slot right now is Amos's Bow. The Amos Bow is a 5-star weapon, so that means it's time to open up the wallet and roll. But before you do that, is it really worth it? If you're a free-to-play player or low spending, the weapon banner is really difficult to roll on because it's going to end up just being a coin flip. You either get it or you don't. That is even if you reach your 5-star. So in this video, we're gonna find out if Amos's Bow really is worth the money. So let's jump into the calculations. All calculations are done using plus 16 5-star artifacts. So that means attack percent, cryo damage bonus percent, crit damage percent, and 258 flat attack from the feather. In addition, we are using a Ganyu at level 70 at Ascension Phase 5 with talent level 8 scaling. So here are the numbers for all of her weapon choices, but there's a lot to digest here. So I went ahead and visualized this into a chart. So this chart is the overall chart for Ganyu's charged attacks, both including crit and non-crit. It's pretty clear from this that Amos's Bow does beat every other bow in the game when it comes to the charged shot. We would hope that this is the case considering that Amos's Bow is a 5-star, and its bonus stat is attack percent. At level 90, it gives you 49.6% extra attack. It's pretty damn insane. And then at Refine 1, it also gives a 20% bonus damage to your normal and charged shots. And then sometimes even more depending on how long your arrow has been in flight. However, I will not be going over the Amos's Bow above Refine 1 because my content is not really geared towards whales, and if you have a refined 5-star weapons, that means you are either really lucky or of course you're just a giant whale. If you do have refined 2 Amos's Bow, then you really don't need to watch any other video on YouTube because it's just going to be blatantly apparent that it's going to be her best weapon. Hell, I mean, if I got a second Amos's Bow, I probably wouldn't even refine it. I'd put it on another character. Anyway, back to the chart. We can see that the next closest weapon that competes with Amos's Bow is the Prototype Crescent and the Black Cliff Warbow, and then the Skyward Harp. This chart has a lot of bars on it, so let's drill down just a little bit more. This is the total damage from a charge attack, meaning this is the arrow and the bloom. This is just your base damage without crit for both attacks. For the most part, you'll usually be hitting crits with the arrow because you're aiming for weak points, but not every enemy in the game has a weak point, so that's still something important we have to consider. Then the bloom damage is going to boil down to your crit rate. When we don't hit crits, the Prototype Crescent is the best 4-star weapon. It competes very well with Amos's Bow when the Amos Bow shoots at point blank range. The Crescent also beats the 5-star Skyward Harp. It also outclasses the Black Cliff Warbow. Another thing to note here is that the 3-star Slingshot is beating the Black Cliff Warbow when it has no buffs applied, and even rivals it when the Warbow does have its buffs. Slingshot is even beating the Skyward Harp. It should be noted, however, that this chart is not taking into account the passive that the Skyward Harp has, which will deal an additional 125% physical damage to enemies 60% of the time. With that passive, the Skyward Harp probably beats the Slingshot. The Slingshot is still doing pretty good damage. Okay, so now let's take a look at crit damage. I think that crit damage might be a little bit more important because as Ganyu, you get a lot of innate crit rate, so this chart will be a little bit more valuable. First, we look at the R1 Prototype and the Warbow. Without any passive buffs, they perform very much well below Amos's Bow, but with their buffs, they perform just slightly below the Amos's bow at point blank range, but still very much well below the Amos's bow when it is played at a typical range, which is around 3 stacks. The 3-star weapons are performing just as good as the 4-star weapons when the 4-star weapons don't have their passive buffs applied. With the passive buffs, however, the warbow will outperform the prototype crescent, although it's just barely outperforming it. The skyward harp is not looking too well with this graph because I don't actually know if the passive can crit, but if the passive is able to crit, then that can definitely change things. The skyward harp performs just as well as the 3-star weapons and worse than the 4-star weapons when the 4-star weapons have their passives applied. Now if we look at the refinement for the 4-star weapons, it begins to compete very nicely with the point blank Amos's bow. 3-stack Amos's bow is going to win all the time, which is typically the range that you'll be playing with, but of course this is to be expected of a 5-star weapon. But it is very nice to see that refined 4-star weapons aren't really that much worse than the Amos's bow. Okay, so we've considered both non-crit damage and crit damage. So this next chart is showing us the total combined damage of both of those for the charge shaft. This is a good representation if our crit rate isn't that high. If it's around 50%, then this is a pretty good graph to represent that. So with that considered, this is pretty much the overall performance of each weapon when we stack up their damage like this. So what this chart shows us is that both of the 4-star weapons, the Crescent and the Warbow, they perform pretty much the same. And of course the Amos Bow is doing the best out of all the weapons. Our conclusions from the other graphs still hold true. With buffs, the Prototype and the Warbow perform the best, and with refinement, they don't do that much worse than the Amos Bow at typical ranges. Ganyu's kit is not entirely comprised of just her charge shot. We need to consider her burst. So we're going to take a look at how these weapons affect the damage on Ganyu's burst. The thing to note here is that Amos's bow does not affect the damage of Ganyu's burst at all, and it becomes clear that the Prototype and the Warbow are performing just as well or even better than Amos's bow. Take note that this chart is not including crit damage. So even at refinement 1, the Prototype is beating Amos's bow in terms of burst damage. And then when the Warbow has all of its stacks, then it performs only slightly lower than Amos's bow. Now, when we consider crit damage with Ganyu's ult, the Warbow is what wins out, only when it has all 3 of its stacks. And even though it wins, it only slightly outperforms the Prototype when the Prototype has its buffs. Even without any buffs, the Prototype beats the Warbow in terms of crit damage, which is surprising because the Warbow actually gives you crit damage as its main stat. And again, Amos's bow does not benefit Ganyu's burst at all, and performs slightly worse than the 4 stars when they have their buffs. When we refine our 4-star weapons, they really start to outshine Amos's bow. Now consider the full duration of the burst, where if we just average out the amount of hits that it can hit an enemy, which is probably somewhere around the range of 10 to 20 hits, I'll just call it 12 hits to be a little bit on the low side, but also being considerate in that this burst can do a lot of damage. When we combine both crit and non-crit damage, we again get an overall representation of the damage if our crit rate is around 50%. All of these numbers, they really do stack up and can make a big difference in damage between the Amos Bow and the 4-star weapons. And it is very clear that the 4-star weapons beats the Amos Bow when it comes to elemental burst damage. So now let me try to condense everything and give you guys a final conclusion on which weapon I think is the best for Ganyu. I think that this chart right here makes it a little bit more clear to see which options we should choose from. It directly compares the Prototype with its buff, the Blackcliff with its buff, and the Amos Bow with 3 stacks. I'm comparing this because I think that these are all very typical situations in which you will find yourselves in. And so in conclusion, the Prototype Crescent is probably the best overall 4-star weapon. Amos's bow is definitely the best, but it does not completely overshadow the free-to-play options. So how should we choose between the 4-star weapons? The Warbow will perform ever so slightly better if your crit rate is high. If you have spare Star Glitter, then you can consider spending it on the Warbow. out. But for me personally, I would rather spend that star glitter on characters and constellations. I don't think that the slight differences in the crit damage is enough to justify the star glitter. Prototype Crescent is going to depend on your prototype drop rate and is pretty much RNG dependent, but at this point I think for most players they'll have at least gotten one bow prototype drop. If you haven't, then I'm sorry to say, but you're on the pretty unlucky side of things, and you're probably on the very left side of the bell curve. The last thing you also have to consider is the uptime on the passives. In my opinion, I believe that the passive from the Crescent will be much easier to maintain. The Blackcliff Warbow requires 3 kills, and at that point you've either halfway cleared out a Hilichurl camp in the overworld, or there's only 1 or 2 left. Most of the later Abyss floors also don't have very many enemies, so the Prototype Crescent's passive will be easier to maintain. However, for the Prototype Crescent, not all enemies have weak spots, i.e. slimes, or when a Ruin Guard is deactivated. As for the Warbow, the most common situation where the passive is more readily available over the Prototype Crescent is going to be against a large amount of slimes. But that situation doesn't really present itself in the later floors of the Abyss, except for, I believe it's floor 11-1, where there's a bunch of slimes. And of course, this is just the second rotation of the Spiral Abyss, as it can definitely change a lot more in the future. And then of course, both of these weapons have terrible passive uptime when it comes to bosses like Dvalin or the Elemental Cube Hypostasis. Next, I would definitely recommend against rolling in the weapon banner for Amos's Bow, because we can factor in the overall performance with the burst damage. If we factor in both charge shots and burst damage, the 4-star weapons potentially have a higher DPS output than Amos's Bow. Either that, or it is going to perform very similarly to the Amos Bow. I think that proper Ganyu play definitely involves using your skills and your burst, because your burst gives you an extra 20% cryo damage bonus. And of course, I mentioned that refinement is going to boost our damage even more, and that's when the prototype really starts catching up to the Amos when it comes to charge attacks, and definitely beats the Amos Bow when it comes to elemental burst damage. Refinement is going to depend on RNG, but it's arguably one of the easier things to refine for free-to-play or low-spending players. In this video, I also did not consider any amount of refinement for the Amos Bow, because most people are not whales or lucky enough to pull 2 of the same 5-star weapon. So anyway, ultimately, I think that both of the 4-star weapons, the Blackcliff Warbow and the Prototype Crescent, they perform so similarly that you can't really go wrong with either one. It is really just going to boil down to your luck and whether or not you want to spend your star glitter. And the last thing I want to say before I sign off is to mention that the 3-star slingshot is actually a very decent weapon for Ganyu to use, so don't sleep on that weapon either. Alright guys, thank you, and I will see you guys later.